Welcome to the Cohort Sisters podcast, where we give voice to the stories, struggles, and successes of Black women and non binary folks with doctoral degrees. I'm your host, Dr. Jamakola, and in this episode, we're honored to have Dr. Niah Grimes. With a doctorate in education and a focus on college student affairs administration from the University of Georgia, Dr. Grimes is a passionate advocate for social justice, mental health awareness, access to higher education, and the prevention of sexual violence. Dr. Grimes received awards like the Mary Frances Early College of Education's Research Award, and her research has centered on addressing campus sexual violence and dismantling systems of domination in higher education. As an assistant professor in the Department of Advanced Studies, Leadership and Policy at Morgan State University, her mission is clear: to shine a light on African spirituality, explore the unique experiences of students with intersecting minoritized identities, and work relentlessly towards a more just and equitable higher education landscape. Welcome to the show, Dr. Grimes.
Wow. I feel like I don't even know how to introduce myself now because that was so comprehensive and thorough. I'm so glad to be here. Hi.
Well, we're excited that you're here. And so the introduction that I want to ask from you is because we know who you are professionally, or a little bit about who you are professionally now, but tell us a little bit about who you are as a person. Where are you from? Where do you live? What are some things that you like to do outside of work?
Right. Well, I often say like I'm an artist moonlighting as a professor
I love
because
that.
I have this, right? I have this strong value of security and artists and art just aren't valued
Mhm.
in so many ways for us to create in really secure ways. And I have a chronic illness. It's something that I talk about, I research. And so I just needed like insurance and benefits and a
Mhm.
job and
Mhm.
like steady
Mhm.
paycheck. And so I was like, what can I do that will afford me that, but also allow me to be an artist? And I originally started off in counseling. So I feel like as a professor, it's just all of the things I love: creation, education, empowerment. You're constantly learning. And so, yeah, it's been great. Me personally, I don't even know where to go. There's so much to say. I'm really just a spiritual person. So I love being in nature as much as I can. I grew up in South Jersey near the ocean. So, like, as much as I can spend time in water, I was in water yesterday um,
Right.
because I was in a really bad flare up and needed some attention. So, yeah, I just am constantly trying to find ways to just reground and recharge in nature. And then because of that chronic illness, like I pamper myself to the upteenth extent. I'm just like, if we work hard, we need to play hard, like harder,
Mhm.
or heal
Mhm.
harder, whatever that looks like. Hobbies include I love cooking. Right now, I'm taking up this initiative to learn as many of my family's recipes as
Mhm.
possible. Um, it's just really been hard, especially after COVID, recognizing the existentialism of just like we're not always going to be in this moment together, and so I just want to hold on to them in the recipes. So I've been learning and cooking, and that has been really just soul filling. And then I really love art, new restaurants, so my partner and I will try different exciting cuisine that we've never had before. We go to the museums a lot. We just went to this dope exhibit in Baltimore, and it was solely Black artists,
Mhm.
so it was like for the culture, and that was like beautiful. So things like that really like ground me and energize me, and then you can just catch me like resting
Mhm.
to just prepare to do this work that we've sort of signed on to do. So I think that's like a little bit about me in a nutshell. I could say a lot more, but we have a lot of
Mhm.
questions, so.
Yeah. So I am astounded because I've actually never heard anyone come like up front and say that you pursued being a professor as like that wasn't, not that that wasn't the dream, but it was like a means to an end. And I appreciate you saying that because that's actually just real. Like it's really real. And I wish that more people would talk about like the security and the stability, and especially if you get tenure, it's like lifetime of a secured job. And the expectations
Mhm.
are very, very more or less pretty clear. There is some
Right.
instability built into the profession with tenure, and like with having to kind of like hop around if you don't get tenure, or even securing that first faculty position, tenure track faculty position, which some people, it just takes a really long time to do so. But if you're able to hack it, like it actually is a stable, secure career that affords enough
Mhm.
flexibility for you to pursue other things. So I just like never heard anyone come out like outright and say it like that. So I just really appreciate you you sharing
Thank you.
that. At what point did you realize, okay, I have this passion for art, but that's
Mhm.
maybe not the way that I'm going to be able to sustain myself financially. So let me also pursue this other thing. Like, when do you feel like you had that realization?
I was really young. So I
Mhm.
remember this was in elementary school back in like the
Oh wow.
90s before they were cutting art programs left and right for STEM and stuff. Like we were just learning how to type and things like
Hmm.
that. And I remember being like poured into by the art programs in my school. And
Hmm.
that was really fun. And I think one of the things that I've been grieving recently is that that didn't continue because I would have
Hmm.
loved to have seen where I would have been on that
Hmm.
trajectory.
Hmm.
Before going into undergrad, I very much knew like, okay, I'm probably going to go into some sort of service oriented field. I like working with people. I always had a sort of sense of like the injustices going on.
Hmm.
Because even, right, like I'm even thinking about this idea of security, like there isn't any security in capitalism. And so it's
Hmm.
really just trying to find as much security as I can garner until we're
Yeah.
free.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so I was like, I know I can't work a 9 to 5. I will be bored out of my mind. Don't have me typing, doing no reports. I can't, I can't use my like creativity to help
Hmm.
like these corporations do more
Hmm.
harm to my community. So I didn't feel comfortable doing that.
Hmm.
And so I was like, what can I do? I was interning at the time working with displaced mothers with mental illnesses and their children,
Hmm.
and homeless and neglected and foster youth. And I
Hmm.
was like, this is where my energy should go, like in the
Yeah.
community with the folks who need it the most. So I noticed in that organization, and I tell my students this too, like, even if you're not in your dream role, pay attention to the organizations you're in and the roles, the various roles. Are there any that you really identify with? I identified with the LPC, the counselor. I was like, she's real. She's helping people right at the heart.
Yeah.
I was like, this is what I'm trying to do. So I went and got my degree in counseling. And in counseling, I always just ended up getting like drawn towards these higher ed student affairs counseling roles. So it would be like um, sexual violence. That's how I started my sexual violence work. And then clinical community counseling, like in a college center, working with students with disabilities. And so I loved it. But I realized that like oppression was trauma. And most of the folks I was working with were oppressed. They weren't, it was nothing wrong with them. And
Hmm.
so I said, well, talking about it is not finna fix none of it.
Yeah.
So now I gotta pivot because I'm like deeply empathetic. So like thinking about just all of it, like it can bring me to tears. And
Hmm.
so I was like, I need to have purpose in a way that I feel like is moving us forward. Because if not, I'll just wallow. Like just thinking about it, like I'm tearing up now.
Hmm. Wow.
And so I went to get my PhD because I figured I'm working in these institutions. Maybe they'll listen to me more if I have a PhD because I would be
Hmm.
coming up with all these great policies,
Hmm.
programmatic initiatives, and things. And no one was taking it seriously, or they would just sort of be like, "Not your job, sweetie." So
Hmm.
it was pissing me off. So I went and got my doctorate. My mentor, Dr. Chris Linder, at the time, she was like, you would be so good at faculty life.
Hmm.
Like, you're disciplined, there's time freedom, you get to do this, this, and that, and you're good at teaching
Hmm.
service. Like, you do those things naturally and like want to do them. And I, being dyslexic and dyscalculic, neurodivergent, having a chronic illness, I'm like, I'm just trying to end oppression. I don't really know about this faculty life. I'm first gen in all the ways. So
Hmm.
I was just like, what
Yeah.
in the what? Like, I didn't really understand it. And my parents are just like, what are you doing? Like, aren't you? Well, my mom got it. I should say my father. He was just like, shouldn't you be in college to get money and you're not making any money? They're paying you
Mhm.
less and you're doing like,
Mhm.
it just didn't make sense to them. And I was like, I
Mhm.
have a vision. I see
Yeah.
it. And so it's really through just like happenstance, following the path of least resistance, really listening to myself and not settling for what I didn't want, knowing my strengths, all those things. And then I end up here and I love it. I
Mhm.
mean, it has its qualms like anything, but
Yeah.
there's so many other situations I could be in that are harder, that I have been in that are harder, that aren't
Mhm.
sustainable for someone with my identity. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I love how you said that you chose to follow the path of least resistance. I think that that's also very powerful for folks who feel like they are just like fighting against a lot of things. Um,
Hmm.
and sometimes the best way to fight is to, as you said, is to get yourself to a point where no one can argue with you when you've got some letters at the end of your name, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
It's like
so, I
formalize
mean,
this now. Right.
right, right. And I also feel like that point is interesting because someone who I've spoken to recently also had a similar path to the doctorate in that they were working and they really felt as if they weren't getting the respect that they deserved because
Mhm.
and so they saw the doctorate as a way to earn that respect and get that respect. And I'm just curious and I'm only asking you this because you seem like a very introspective person and like self-reflexive person. So how did you navigate like pursuing the doctoral degree, pursuing a PhD so that others could respect the policies, all the or ideas that you had in your workplace without
Mhm.
externalizing, like without having an external reward for the PhD. Does that kind of make sense? Because like I feel like you get to a point, especially like when it's hard, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the times that it was challenging for you, where you really have to
Right.
like do it for yourself, and it has to be internally the motivation for the degree has to be internally driven and like driven by some larger purpose. So I'm curious as to how you balance like the internal and that's the phrase I'm looking for, intrinsic and extrinsic motivations for getting the doctoral degree.
I see. So for me, it was like a few different things, right? Because at the end of the day, even if I'm credentialed, some people are still not going to listen. Like some
Yeah,
people
yeah,
are dedicated to misunderstanding, not listening, and to being
yeah.
oppressed. Because even those in power, like you're oppressed too, like you're blocked
Mm,
too. We're not
mm-hmm,
all just living to our highest potential. And so I think I knew that it was more than a credential, but that with the credential, I would get power and access.
mm,
Like I saw the gatekeeping
mm,
mechanisms, and I knew with those letters, I would be able to just break through, like regardless of identity, regardless of who is upset and doesn't want me in the room at the table writing policy or what,
yeah.
that there were certain places that I wouldn't be kept out of just simply because I had the doctorate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can't do human subjects research really unless
Mhm.
you're
Yeah.
rich or you're connected to an institution.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, like all of those things, we don't respect people as epistemic knowers. And
Mhm.
so, for my knowledge to be seen as knowledge,
Mm.
now it is because it's
Yeah.
going in journals.
Yeah.
People can I was like, I'll just work the system to liberation. And
Mhm.
so that was sort of like I was like, okay, I'm doing this very intentionally with a purpose. I know this isn't really going to change much as far as how I'm perceived because of the culture that we're in, but it will get me access. It will get me access to power, and I can use that, in love. So
Mhm.
that's what I've
Yeah.
been trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You are doing the damn thing. Um, so you mentioned that you were first gen in several ways, and so once you made the decision to pursue a doctorate, where did you find the tools, the resources, the community, the mentorship in order to prepare a strong application and then make the
Hmm.
decision to go to UGA?
Right. So spirit holds me down 1,000%. I don't know if others feel that connected, but like I can see that my life is divinely ordered. That's why I follow the path of least resistance because, you know, in my belief system, God and the ancestors see things that I just can't see. And so I have to listen in certain ways. I would end up in situations just because spirit put me there, not realizing like I would need it later.
Hmm.
Prime example. I choose George Mason because I initially wanted to be in close proximity to DC without having to go like a military route.
Okay.
Um, and then I ended up not even wanting to go into government and politics. However, Mason at the time was an R2. There was all of this undergraduate research funding.
Mm.
My professor saw just intrinsically that like I'm a researcher and an educator. So they were like pouring all of this undergraduate research
Mm.
into me,
Mhm.
which primed me later to get a PhD.
Yeah.
And again, like with my identities, had I not had that, but that wasn't intentional. That was just because people were like, hey, and I was like, psh, yeah, you get money for it? I'm doing it anyway, you know? And so it was really good mentorships. And that's why I love
Mm.
higher ed and student affairs because I am a product of good
Mm.
faculty, good student
Yeah.
affairs, good
Yeah.
policy. Like it supported me in so many ways through and through. And I could say that for most of the institutions that trained me, even if there were a lot of issues still, right?
Yeah.
So, um, I then end up going into career counseling. And so I was training people and counseling people how to get into PhD programs, how to
Mm.
get into
Mhm.
do right all of these things that I was then going to have to do. So then when it was time for me to get into a PhD program, I was surrounded by and connected to all these resources because I was helping students get into the best
Mhm.
PhD programs in the world. So, um yeah, I was able to like write a personal statement and then have someone in my office who reviews personal statements for a living review it.
Yeah. Wow.
You know, the privilege because of spirit, just
Mhm.
putting me in those
Mhm.
places so that I could access those skills that I didn't have the forethought to go and seek out because I
Mhm.
didn't know any better.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love such divine placement and order in your life. We love to see it. So let's talk about
Yeah.
your time at the University of Georgia. What were some of the highest points for you? Like, what was, aside from getting the degree, what were some of the major
Mhm.
successes? And then what were some of the challenging aspects of your doctoral journey?
Of course. So shout out to Black Kasa. Um, Black Kasa was this homegrown community because I love Black people and our ability to find joy, to
Mhm.
create community, to create really what we need in any situation. Like you can put African descendants in the most dire straits, and we
Yeah.
are gonna be like, all right, but I'm still gonna laugh, and
Mhm.
we still gonna, kick
Yeah.
it and support each other and heal. And I just love that about us. I don't know if like people really see the magic that we are. And
Mhm.
so Black Kasa was basically there were just a bunch of these black docs at UGA. UGA
Mhm.
isn't an HBCU. There was no really real reason. And typically you don't see a concentration of black doc students in one place. And I was curious about it. I was like, what is going on here? What is UGA doing to recruit, sustain, and matriculate
Mhm.
these
Yeah.
black students? I was just enamored. And so I was reaching out to the community there, and that's sort of how I got situated there. And they're also the community that helped me matriculate, just supporting me
Yeah.
through, helping me with like the hidden curriculum,
Mhm.
and still helping me with the hidden curriculum. It doesn't stop,
Yeah.
right? So that was definitely a high. My mentor, Dr. Linder. So I think it's so important, especially if you're first gen and you're trying to figure this higher ed crap out. Like, what do they call it? I'm doing a study now where it shows up, but I'm blanking on the language for it. But basically, like the familial aspects of like who trains you.
Mm.
And Dr. Linder, she did some hell of a training. Like she made sure that I was equipped to do the role that I wanted to do.
Mhm.
And so, without her, I'm not an assistant professor. It's just important to name that.
Mhm.
So it makes me think about how important my role is now
Yeah.
to do that same thing.
Right, right.
Um, Lows. I mean, I was in the southeastern United States. Like I was in Athens, Georgia, as a queer black femme from the Northeast. It was a wild mess.
Mm,
I remember the first time I got there and I was just like culture shock. So I lived in Atlanta, but then commuting was so hard and I feel like I missed out on having community like in Athens because
mm,
I was always commuting. I had a chronic illness, so I was always sick and in the doctor's office more than I was kind of in community with my peers.
mm,
So that really was hard. I didn't have much family in Atlanta or in that area. So I think just like those things. And then institutions aren't built for folks who are in daily chronic pain,
mm,
folks who have
mhm.
disabilities.
Yeah.
We talk about our blackness and, our racial ancestry. We'll talk about, being queer
Mhm.
or gender fluid. We'll talk about
Mhm.
those things and
Yeah.
these other identities. But I feel like folks who are disabled don't get that same
Mhm.
platform.
Yeah.
And it's not until like I specifically mention it, which is why I'm always talking about it, people will then be like, "Oh yeah, me too," or "I have that," or so and
Mm,
so.
mhm.
And you see how it's impacting us all. And so because there weren't any like true structures for me, I had to navigate and create the
Mhm.
structures. Thankfully, I was in a higher ed program with folks who knew the research and were like amenable to that.
Mm,
Had I been in a different field, a different program, a different institution, like that might not have been the case.
right.
And I know for a fact, even though it's not widely studied, but based on my anecdotal data, folks with disabilities are not matriculating, especially
Mm,
at the doctoral level,
mhm.
at the same rate
Yeah.
as folks without. You know, so that's hard. And so yeah, just thinking about like what is my role in trying
Mhm.
to fix that.
Right, right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about your dissertation? And I want to now start pivoting towards your work as an assistant professor. So, would love to know two-part question. I feel like I'm always doing two-part questions because I just have so many thoughts and so many things in my mind. Part one is what was your dissertation about? And part two,
Okay.
do you still study any element of your dissertation at like as an assistant professor and in your current like where you currently are in your career?
Okay, yeah. So for my dissertation, I pivoted because I was really just focused in sexual violence work on campus.
Mm,
But as I was experiencing what I sort of just spoke about, I wanted to interrogate myself more and my experience of navigating higher ed with my identities.
mhm,
I had the privilege because we had a qualitative research department at UGA of taking a lot of strong qualitative research classes. And one of them was autoethnography.
mm,
And it's like I found the methodology for me.
yeah.
As someone who really believes in like the power of story and
Mhm,
narrative and
mhm,
as you mentioned, like just self-reflection and introspection
mhm,
and critical self-accountability,
mm,
right? Autoethnography was a methodology that valued all of that. I felt so seen. And then from that, because you have these brilliant theorists who like right take something and make it better, you have now like a whole field of self-inquiry data. So I did a spiritual ethnography, which is like a type of autoethnography or a type of self-inquiry, but it centers spirit, and it was developed by Dr. Dillard, Cynthia Dillard. And so that what I did was I ended up using life note data that was longitudinal over the course of 4 years of getting my degree. And then with a research team and myself, we combed through it in like all of these different ways. So coding for spirit and coding for just like what's happening in our bodies and coding for
mm,
power. And then I recreated sort of in the style and lineage of Octavia Butler, this like reimagined Afrofuturistic future where
mm,
they found my data in the future and like used it to make better policy or to make sure that they weren't doing those
mm,
harmful things or enacting that same harm in higher ed. And
mhm,
yeah, so that was sort of my dissertation. What I'm
Wow.
doing now is I had made it into like a manuscript length dissertation, um, which is like a whole different study. I just took the data and then wrote sort of about how to heal instead of thinking about like descriptive data. This is what's going on. I feel like we know the pain and violence and
Hmm.
trauma of living in oppression. And so now I want to think about, okay, how do we heal? How do we liberate? How do we dream? How do we create? So that piece, I hope to submit soon to a qualitative journal. And then I want to submit grants to start doing larger, big studies focusing solely on folks on campus with chronic pain disorders like endometriosis, fibromyalgia, diabetes, you know, a bunch of different disorders under the
Hmm.
sun. So that will be like my next focus. And then I'm
Hmm.
always doing work around campus sexual violence. So
Yeah.
it kind of has become, I guess, my dissertation work and that like love for that methodology has become like its own line of
Mm.
my scholarship. And I keep
Hmm.
that same line for campus sexual violence still.
Hmm. That is the most interesting dissertation approach that I've ever heard. It's like I feel like as soon as now that I know, if you hadn't told me at the very beginning that you are an artist, I like
Mm,
would have come to that eventually because it's such a creative. Literally, I did not even know that was possible to be able to one. I mean, I'm not familiar with qualitative
mm,
methodology, but to be able to do an autoethnography, I think, that I've heard of, but to then
mhm,
like the Afrofuturistic piece, like part of it, like what that is just like my mind is blown. And to be able to do, I think why my mind is so blown is because you were able to do that in a an education program. I think I would have assumed that that is a kind of study that maybe would have been okay in an English literature program or something about like fiction or that was more writing based or like creative thinking
mhm,
based. So I just love that you were able to really bring your full self, meaning your experiences, your identity, your methodology, your preferred way of presenting the work, even to your scholarship. And like, kudos to your department for allowing that to manifest. So cool.
thank you.
I want to read it. So cool.
Like, I mean, it's still a dissertation, so it's probably a hot mess. But, it was fun to be able to begin dreaming and thinking and
Yeah.
exercising like my scholarly muscles in that way and learning right directly from the folks who were writing in this methodology, creating this
Hmm.
methodology. Um, it's just an honor, a true privilege. And that's why I'm so dedicated to like spreading this knowledge and like trying to inspire and like
Yeah.
really get this out there because of the privilege that I had to learn it and
Hmm.
receive it. And like you said, for a committee to be like, yes, go and do that, they
Yeah.
really were like, we see the vision. And again, it was like very qualitatively rigor. Like we had
Hmm.
over, hundreds of life note data. I think they all averaged almost 350 to 500 words. So I
Mm.
had a research team, and there were like several themes and sub themes. So yeah,
Mm.
it was fun, and I learned a lot about myself, which I think is so important if
Hmm.
we're going to conduct scholarship, especially
Right.
around vulnerable populations, topics that can oppress or
Hmm.
empower. Like we really need
Hmm.
to understand how we're socialized,
Yeah.
because I was interrogating myself in that as well.
Hmm. And
Hmm.
I'm trying to think of if there's anything that I learned about myself in my dissertation process. I'm sure if I dig deep, there probably is, but I do think it's really special to be able to use the dissertation as not only an opportunity to research something that no one else has researched or to kind of like ask new questions, but to really be introspective and learn about yourself and learn about your positionality as a scholar and as a researcher, because as you mentioned, like the more that we understand our own identities and perspectives and biases, like the better that we can show up, especially those of us who do work on marginalized and oppressed populations, right? So if we can better understand where we're coming from and the different things that are shaping even the questions that we ask, the ways that we ask those questions, hopefully our scholarship can be better. and approach liberation more clearly, and more, not more clearly, but yeah, just be more liberatory in our research practices and our methods. But we can't do that unless we really know who we are. So you give me so much to think about. I'm just like in awe. I want to talk
Thank
about
you.
one aspect of
Mhm.
your work that you brought up earlier, which is spirituality and African spirituality. How do you see spirituality intersecting with higher education, and what benefits do you think that it can bring to campus environment and student experiences?
I think the fact that we even have to ask that question just shows how separated,
Hmm.
splintered we are from our humanness and our spirit.
Hmm.
Because, like, spirit should be the foundation for which everything is built in. I think, like, when people say indigenous, that's really what they mean. Like,
Mm.
when I research different indigenous, tribal, African um, ways of knowing, being, and what I've just encompassed as like a cosmology or spirituality, I've just found these inherent patterns over and over that you don't see in like the Abrahamic organized
Mm.
religions.
Mhm.
And for me, the major things that come across that I talk about in my writing are just like, God, like, and not God gendered or God
Mhm.
based out of whiteness, but just like source. We all are living and we come from a living source. Like we all are connected, and we're like this idea of separation is an illusion that we
Mm.
experience in this in this world, in this life. But I think if we were to remember our spirituality, remember our connectedness, like gun violence, sexual violence, like are you gonna shoot yourself?
Mm.
No.
Mm.
And so um that is sort of what I come to and think about. I also think about just nature, like the actual
Mhm.
land that we embody and encompass. We have to respect it, we have to honor it,
Mhm.
we have to build and live with it, like
Mhm.
not make it bend to our needs and will. Because as I think we've all seen this past
Mhm.
summer,
Yeah.
the world will, like, nature will bounce back and push
Mhm.
back and show us who really is in control. um and then just like the spirit, like our spirit guides, like our ancestry, like we're connected to
Mhm.
something greater than ourselves, this long
Mhm.
lineage of love and karma and but like all of these things. So I just try to think about that, and that is what I feel like makes me human. And how can we just make sure that that's infused, that that is like the grounding upon which we
Mhm.
then learn and grow and love, because that's where it all stems from. Like that is our foundation. And I think once we really start to look at the roots, the our shared values, our connections, and what's really going on underneath these systems of dominations, these
Mhm.
interactions, we can begin to really like make choices, critical choices as a collective about what we're going to tolerate and what we will not tolerate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the point that you made about if we have a fundamental understanding of like interconnectedness, then we wouldn't do harm to one another because we would be doing harm to ourselves. I found that really, really powerful. I've never thought about that, but that's, yeah, that was compelling. You sold me. Um, so I want to talk now about your transition into becoming an assistant professor. Can you walk us through what that was like for you? Did you go right on the market as you were finishing up your dissertation? Just what was the process for you? Reflect on that time a little bit.
So I knew myself and I knew I wouldn't be able to dissertate, apply for jobs,
Hmm.
and just like be well.
Hmm.
So, and I had to get this major surgery. And I wanted to have time enough to heal after the surgery to then go into teaching, because I wanted to try to be as much as I could like my best teaching self.
Yeah.
So I finished my dissertation, and I actually got surgery like while I was finishing my dissertation.
Mm.
And then I just made sure that I was committed to writing and staying on writing projects, staying on research projects while I healed and recovered from surgery. And I found a job that would basically allow me to write. And then
Mm.
for a year, I just wrote and applied to jobs after I dissertated. Um, I had also been particular in wanting to be in a specific geographic location. So my
Mhm.
family is predominantly in Maryland and like the DC, Virginia area. And I didn't want to be far from them anymore. And I didn't want to build a
Yeah.
family far from them. Um, and so I also knew that not every institutional type would value my
Mhm.
values or me as a scholar.
Mhm. Mhm.
But um, being at HBCU and specifically being at Morgan, it's just such a great fit. And so I was just really lucky that like that cycle, that timeline,
Mhm.
again, spiritual like alignment, it all fell into
Mhm.
place.
Yeah.
But I had sort of watched the market for 2 years. And even in the first year while
Mm.
I was dissertating, I didn't really see a lot of positions that would have fit with where I was trying to go. And yeah, so that is how I sort of planned it out. And it's not traditional, it's not what all of my peers were doing, but I sort of knew because of what my peers were doing what I was going to need to do differently.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah. That point about, and I don't think people realize this, especially depending on, it can really depend on your field, but there are some years it just depends on the year, right? So, like, as you
Yep.
mentioned, like you said that there was a year you were looking and there weren't a lot of jobs. I felt the same way. Like this, when I ended up getting my position, happened to be a year that there were positions, or was really just this one position that was a good fit for
Mhm.
me. And the
Mhm.
prior year I had like poked around just to kind of see what was going on, and there, like, I don't think I saw like a single historian of medicine role that I would have been a good fit for. So I think that's hopefully encouragement for anyone who's on the market this semester or this fall, is that sometimes it really just boils down to timing and your divine purpose. um and what's for you will be for you. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
want to ask one final question about your work before we start to wind down. You've worked in higher education in a variety of capacities as a counselor, as a professor, um, and at different kinds of institutions, small liberal arts schools. You went to a very large school for your doctoral degree. You're now at an HBCU. I'm curious, how do
Yeah.
you adapt your counseling as well as your teaching and your mentorship to meet different kinds of student needs across different kinds of
Mhm.
campuses?
I think to do this work or to be in service of people and healing and learning, you have to be able to work across diversity and difference. Um, and I thrive in that because I
Mm,
think the more that I can be introduced to new perspectives, new ways of being, thinking, and doing, like I can dream better, I can think better, I can be freer.
mhm,
So I really enjoyed like institutional hopping. But I also know that that's what like ultimately has shown me like what institutions are best for me.
mhm,
I
yeah,
think something that allows me to pivot or just meet people where they are is recognizing that like there's always something that connects me to an institution or a
mm,
person or a group. Like I usually can always find some sort of connection because
yeah,
we just have a lot of like we share a lot of similarities, and I think sometimes we focus on the differences,
mhm,
and I just try
yeah,
to focus on the similarities in instances where I feel like I could be othered or it's new. Um, and then I also think all the time about what are my strengths, what do I bring to any given like community or situation, especially regarding like what might be missing,
mm,
because other people have strengths, other people have got this covered. Like, how can I help the gaps, like
yeah,
wherever I'm at, to be useful in the space? And I think when you just have that mindset, you can flow in any environment or kind of with anyone. I'm open to feedback all the time. So, like, knowing that to do this work is to get it wrong, but that wrong really just
mm,
shows you like the next direction, like what's
yeah,
right. And
yeah.
that, like, I learned that in counseling because clients would be like, no, that's not what I said. I'd be like, of course, let's run it back. Like, help me understand. Um, I thought I was tracking and I wasn't. Or I thought
Mhm,
when you meant, and so I just find that yeah, I just accept that, I don't have it all figured out, and that usually whatever institution I'm learning from or joining, and the people involved will help you learn. And if you're open to listening and then showing up where you can, like, that's always sort of worked for me. So that's
Yeah.
been, kind of how I navigate it. I'd be curious to hear other people's answer to that question as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, if I can think of anyone else, I can't think of anyone at the top of my head who has had a similar experience, especially as a counselor. But if I come across, if we interview someone soon, I will be sure to let you know. So, reflecting back on your doctoral journey, if you had to do it all over again, what is one thing that you would do differently?
Sometimes I think about, like, should I have gotten a doctoral degree in something else, since I am
Hmm.
a transdisciplinary scholar. So my
Hmm.
first degree was in sociology, then counseling, and then education. And because I'm so artistic, I'm like, should I have done communications or creative arts or something
Mm.
that would allow me to just go straight into media? Because I would love to make like TV and film. Like, I feel like I have these
Mm.
TV shows and movie ideas constantly running in my head. And before I leave this earth, I just want to see them on a screen.
Yeah.
I don't care if no one else likes them. Like, I just want to see them.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to figure that out, but I feel like there
Okay.
might have been a degree that could have been like a better fit for that.
Mm.
However, uh, I love education. I love the creative possibilities in education.
Mhm.
I love being able to write and work with students, and yeah, just everything that I'm afforded to do because of this degree, and the
Yeah.
time freedom alone. I mean, time freedom is priceless,
Yeah.
right? So like in the middle of my day, I get to have this conversation with you because I think
Mhm.
this is worthy, and I didn't have to check in with anyone about it.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
get to really have autonomy over that, and you can't find that nowadays.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would always do it all over again, but maybe think about if there was like a more intentional
Mhm.
program that would better
Mhm.
fit like my needs.
Yeah. Makes sense. So, what is one
Mhm.
final piece of advice that you have for prospective or current Black women and non-binary doctoral students?
I would say whatever you need, get clear about what your needs are and be unapologetic about getting them met, like meeting them yourself and getting them
Mm.
met. Um,
Mhm.
we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait. Oftentimes, we know exactly what we need.
Yeah.
And if we're creative, if we kind of look around at what's out there, we can get those needs met. And I feel like being able to reclaim that, like empower myself in a world that tries
Mm.
to disempower me constantly,
Yeah.
it's just allowed me to survive,
Yeah.
um, and meet my needs, which
Yeah.
allows me to survive. So I just want us to survive and thrive out here. So that would be probably my largest advice. That's what gets me through, I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grimes, for joining us today on the Cohort Sisters podcast and for sharing your story, your journey, your research, your introspection, your reflection on how the rest of us should be thinking about life in the world, and your wonderful advice. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been such a great just honor, and I'm so glad that I got to sit down, and I hope that whoever is listening to this, it really just inspires them to live more authentically and just live in their divine purpose.
Thank you again for listening to this week's episode of the Cohort Sisters podcast. If you are a Black woman interested in joining the Cohort Sisters membership community, or you're looking for more information on how to support or partner with Cohort Sisters, please visit our website at www.cohortsisters.com. You can also find us on all social media platforms at Cohort Sisters. Don't forget to subscribe to the Cohort Sisters podcast and leave us a quick review wherever you're listening. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we'll catch you in next week's episode.